22 children were taken from their families, stripped of their language, and raised as an experiment, and Denmark kept it secret for half a century. In the years following World War II, the Kingdom of Denmark faced an uncomfortable question about its oldest colony. Greenland, a vast Arctic territory populated by the Inuit for millennia, had been governed by Copenhagen for over 2 centuries with little regard for the aspirations of its people. The United Nations was pressuring colonial powers to justify their overseas possessions, and Denmark needed a new narrative. The answer was not independence. The answer was assimilation. The Danish government began drafting plans to transform Greenland from a colonial backwater into a fully integrated county of the Danish state. On paper, this was modernization, new infrastructure, new schools, new opportunities. But behind the policy documents and parliamentary debates lay a far more invasive ambition. Danish officials in the Greenland department, led by figures like Carl Grube, envisioned something unprecedented: the deliberate engineering of a new Greenlandic elite, one that would think in Danish, speak in Danish, and carry Danish values back to the Arctic. What no one outside a small circle of bureaucrats and Red Cross officials knew was how they planned to build that elite, or what it would cost the children chosen to become it. That revelation would not surface for decades, and when it did, it would shake Denmark's image as one of the world's most progressive nations to its core. In 1951, officials from the Danish Red Cross and the Greenland Department fanned out across remote Greenlandic settlements with a proposal for Inuit families. Their children, some as young as 5 years old, had been chosen for a special opportunity. They would travel to Denmark, live with Danish families, learn the language, and return home better prepared for the modern world. It was framed as a gift, a temporary stay, a chance most families in Greenland could never afford to provide on their own. The first cohort consisted of 6 children between the ages of 5 and 8. Among them was a girl named Helene Thiessen, who would carry the weight of this experiment for the rest of her life. The families who agreed to let their children go did so based on promises that the separation would be brief, that their children would come home, that this was being done for their benefit. Representatives like Kirstine Funch of the Danish Red Cross personally assured parents that the program was safe and supervised. None of the families were told the full scope of what was planned. None were given written agreements or legal documentation, and none were informed that this was, in fact, a controlled social experiment designed to test whether Inuit children could be culturally reprogrammed into Danes. The children boarded ships bound for Copenhagen. They did not know they were leaving behind everything they would ever call home. For approximately 18 months, the children lived in Danish households scattered across the country. They ate Danish food. They attended Danish schools. They played with Danish children in Danish neighborhoods, and they were forbidden from speaking Kaloalisut, the only language most of them had ever known. The foster families, by most accounts, were not cruel. Many believed they were doing a good thing, offering warmth and stability to children from what they understood to be difficult circumstances. But the purpose of the placement was not charity. It was transformation. The children were being observed, their progress in language acquisition and cultural adaptation carefully noted. They were expected to shed their identities the way one might shed an old coat, quickly, completely, without looking back. For young children separated from everything familiar, the process was not seamless. It was devastating. Some children cried for weeks, others withdrew into silence. A few adapted outwardly, learning to smile and perform in their new roles, while something inside them fractured in ways that would take a lifetime to understand. But the deepest betrayal was still ahead, because the promise that had made all of this possible, the promise that they would go home to their families, was about to be broken. When the 18 months ended, the children were not returned to their parents. Instead, they were shipped back to Greenland and deposited at the Børnehjemmet, a Danish-language children's home in Nuuk, then called Godhabe. The institution operated entirely in Danish. The children, now fluent enough in Danish to have lost much of their Kalaalisut, were isolated from the Greenlandic-speaking community around them. They were also isolated from their own families, many of whom lived nearby but were given no access to their children. The logic, insofar as there was any, was that returning the children to their original homes would undo the cultural progress the experiment had achieved. The investment in their transformation could not be wasted. and so the children remained in the orphanage, caught in a bureaucratic limbo where no one took responsibility for what had been done to them. Their parents, who had been promised a temporary absence, were offered no explanation. Some tried to visit. Some were turned away. Others, unable to read or write in Danish, had no means to challenge the decisions being made about their children in offices thousands of kilometers to the southeast. The children grew up in that institution, raised in a language that was not theirs, in a country that did not fully accept them, separated from families that had never agreed to give them up. The cruelest legacy of the experiment was not the separation itself. It was what came after. As the children grew into adolescents and then adults, they discovered that they belonged nowhere. They could not speak Kala Alisut fluently enough to reconnect with their families. Conversations with their own mothers and fathers became halting, painful, incomplete. Some parents had moved on, believing their children had been given a better life. Others had spent years grieving. The emotional reunion that might have healed the wound was, in most cases, impossible, not because of distance, but because of language. The very tool the experiment had given them had destroyed the bridge back to the people who loved them. In Greenlandic society, the experiment children were viewed with suspicion. They spoke Danish. They carried themselves differently. They were seen as outsiders, products of a colonial project that most Greenlanders instinctively distrusted. And yet in Denmark, they were still Inuit, never fully accepted, never truly at home. Frederick Linge, a Greenlandic politician and writer, would later describe the impossible position these children occupied. Suspended between two cultures, claimed by neither, the psychological toll was staggering. Depression, alcoholism, social isolation, broken relationships. Several of the 22 children died young. By 2020, only 6 remained alive. The experiment had not created a Danish-speaking elite. It had created a generation of people defined by loss. For decades, the story of the experiment, children existed only in fragments, whispered among families in Greenland, buried in government archives in Copenhagen, known to a handful of officials who had long since retired or died. Denmark's image as a beacon of human rights and social welfare remained untroubled by a reckoning that had simply never arrived. Then, in 1998, Danish anthropologist Tine Brild published a book titled I den bedste mening, with the best intentions. Based on years of interviews with survivors and painstaking archival research, Brild's work laid bare the full scope of the program for the first time. She documented the selection process, the broken promises, the orphanage years, and the lifelong consequences borne by people who had been children when the state decided to use them as instruments of policy. The title itself was an indictment, a reference to the justification that Danish officials had always offered when confronted with uncomfortable questions about Greenland. It was done with the best intentions. Brild's research demonstrated that good intentions, even if they had existed, did not absolve a government of accountability for the suffering it caused. The book generated public attention in Denmark, but it did not immediately produce political action. The surviving experiment children were aging. Time was running out. Helene Thiessen refused to let the story die quietly. As one of the 6 surviving children from the original cohort, she became the most visible advocate for recognition, organizing the other survivors and speaking publicly about what had been done to them. Her campaign was not driven by anger alone. It was driven by a need for the historical record to reflect what had actually happened, not the sanitized version Denmark preferred to tell itself. In 2020, Save the Children Denmark commissioned an independent report examining the experiment in full. The findings were unambiguous. The program had been a deliberate, covert social experiment organized jointly by the Danish government's Greenland Department and the Danish Red Cross. The children had been removed from their families under false pretenses. The promises made to their parents had been systematically broken, and the consequences, the lost language, the shattered families, the psychological damage, were not unfortunate side effects. They were the predictable outcomes of a policy that treated human beings as variables in a colonial equation. The report named the institutions responsible. It documented the chain of decisions that had led to the children's removal, and it confirmed what the survivors had been saying for decades. This was not a misunderstanding. It was a program designed in offices, approved by officials, executed by organizations that knew exactly what they were doing. In December 2020, Danish Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen stood before the 6 surviving experiment children and delivered a formal apology on behalf of the Danish government. She acknowledged that Denmark had wronged them. She acknowledged that the program had caused profound and lasting harm. She used the word that the survivors had waited nearly 70 years to hear from their government. Sorry. For Helene Thiessen and the other survivors, the moment was bittersweet. 16 of the 22 children were already dead. They had lived and died without ever hearing their government take responsibility. The apology, while significant, came without financial compensation. It came without a full truth commission. It came without the kind of systemic accountability that might have ensured the historical record would be permanently and thoroughly corrected. Some advocates pointed out that an apology without material redress was, in the end, just words, and that words had been the instrument of deception from the very beginning, when parents were told their children would come home. What remains is a story that Denmark is still learning how to tell honestly. The experiment børnene, the experiment children, were not statistics or policy outcomes. They were people who had childhoods, families, languages, and futures that were taken from them by the institutions entrusted with their care. Their story is not a relic of a less enlightened era. It is a reminder that the most dangerous experiments are the ones conducted on the powerless, by the powerful, in silence, and that the silence itself is a choice that compounds the original harm with every year it is allowed to endure.